Mr. Johnson, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Now, Patrick, I understand you've been living in Israel for some time now, right?
Yeah. No, I've been over there for about 2-3 years per se.
So you've been volunteering while you've been down there too.
So I've been part of an NGO. The NGO is called Adala. We focus on human rights.
And for our listeners, how do you spell Adala, just so they know what kind of group it is?
Adalah.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. But yeah, as I was saying, we're centered that defends the rights of Palestinian Arabs. We strive to achieve equal individual and collective rights for Palestinian Arab minority. We also focus on land, civil and political, prisoners' rights, human rights, economic, social.
Really everything then?
Yeah.
Okay. Very comprehensive group. And you've been volunteering at this organization, or you've been working there?
Yeah. So since I went over there 3 years ago, I started working about, I'd say, 6 months into my stay over there.
Well, I'm sure you've seen a lot of things down there, and I'm really excited for this conversation we're about to have. It's an issue near and dear to my heart. Actually, when I was an undergraduate at the University of Washington, I'm a political science major, but one of the most interesting classes I ever took was on the Israel-Palestine case, actually. And I remember being a sophomore and being utterly confused by the whole thing. And I scraped by with, a B, but I think by the end of the class, and I still have the notebook from that class, but I never truly understood it. Now as an adult, after years and years of, looking at it, keeping up to date with events, it's a little bit clearer for me now, but
it is such a complicated issue, and there's a lot at stake. There's a lot in play here, so that's totally understanding. I've been there too in college, so.
Well, I think we should start off by kind of like situating this human rights issue in its political and social context. Now, as of today, it is June 5th. Now, a little bit less than a month ago, in May, tensions between Israelis and Palestinians boiled over, as we both know, and led to 11 days of extreme violence. There was a ceasefire on May 21st, but at any moment things could resume. How did all this start?
So, Palestinian families were being evicted by Israeli courts during Ramadan in the village of Sheikh Jarrah. It's just east of Jerusalem.
Okay.
Palestinians have been protesting the evictions of those 14 people.
14 people or 14 families?
14 families, my bad.
Okay, fine. So, and this is in Sheikh Jarrah. Is this like a large neighborhood in Jerusalem, or?
So Sheikh Jarrah is kind of a holy site, and these evictions are happening just south of Sheikh Jarrah, a couple miles away.
Okay. So it's not just any random neighborhood. This is this is a big deal.
This is a big deal. So.
Okay.
So Palestinians basically started protesting those evictions, small clash with the police, and then, as you know, came Friday night, May 7th.
May 7th, yeah. I think we were all surprised on that night. Let's set the scene, why don't we? It is Ramadan, correct?
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the last few days of Ramadan, actually. People are fasting, praying, reflecting on their community, growing together closer. And I think it's important that we keep this in mind. These families that are being evicted, ending up on the streets, becoming homeless even, is in a month of intense prayer and fasting in community. It's not just any arbitrary time of the year. This is a really important time of the year for these Palestinian people. As we all know, the location where this all really kicked off is the iconic Aqsa Mosque, which, as I understand it, is the third holiest site in Islam.
Correct. You're correct.
So these evictions, they're ongoing, they're worsening for these families. I remember reading, actually, just a month prior, far-right Israelis were marching through the city center, chanting death to Arabs. And I do believe there were also multiple mob attacks by Jewish groups So a lot of nationalism, essentially, in this area. There's a lot of nationalism. This Friday night, again, setting the scene. Thousands of worshipers are leaving Friday prayer. Nationalist Jews are gathered there along with police protection. Now, things escalate, and all of a sudden, more than 150 are injured by rocks, stun grenades, or less lethal forms of munition like rubber bullets.
Oh. So, as you were saying, after these events, where 150 people were injured, after Hamas's warnings to Israelis not to disturb the peace of this holy event.
Okay, so Hamas gave this warning prior to the night,
Correct.
saying not to disturb these Ramadan prayers.
Yes, well, I mean, it's a holy day for them. And in response to the 150 that were injured, on May 10th, Hamas launched rockets from Gaza into Israel.
Okay, and I think for the viewers who are not super familiar with Hamas, Hamas is a political group, according to some, and according to others, it is a terrorist group.
Yes.
Hamas is in Gaza. Gaza, of course, is like the West Bank, an area of land that is disputed territory. Israelis claim somewhat access to it, as well as Arabs. It's kind of an annexed land, similar to Crimea in Russia, as I understand it. But West Bank is where these protests are happening, is where these evictions are happening. Hamas is in Gaza, and they are a little bit, I think, outside the jurisdiction of the Israeli authorities, more so than the West Bank. The West Bank is really still heavily controlled by Israel, versus Hamas has like you said, they warned the Israelis not to disturb the sanctity of Ramadan, and of course that happened, and so things boiled over. So
and in response, now we got to keep in mind, the viewers understand that Israel has the Iron Dome.
yes,
So all these missiles are shot down. So none of these, there were no casualties directly in the Israeli territories.
Well, that I do believe was the case for the majority of the fighting. But as I understand it, the Iron Dome, and this is actually really interesting. My assistant gave me this information before the podcast. Has an interception rate of, I think, 95%. Now, I believe over 1,000 rockets were fired into, or attempted to be fired into Israeli territory. But it turns out that a lot of these rockets are, poorly made. And so a couple hundred of these rockets actually fell back into Palestinian or Gaza territory. Didn't make it into Israel. I think 12 Israelis were killed.
So now, was this in or around Gaza's territory, or were these
very
Israeli
close?
kills? Oh, very close. Okay.
So the Iron Dome covers almost all. I mean, it intercepts almost everything. But when you're firing a dozen rockets a minute, there's going to be every once in a while a failure. And I don't exactly remember the exact areas that any casualties happen, but I have some astounding. I mean, like I said, my assistant prepared this information ahead of time for us. Thank you, Austin. Over 72,000 Palestinians were displaced in the West Bank and Gaza. And this was what? 11 days of fighting? 72,000 Palestinians displaced from their homes or had to move because of fears of maybe they were in dangerous areas in the West Bank and Gaza. Now, over 300 Palestinians were killed. Of course, these are all civilians, really. I mean, there are going to be some militia groups and stuff like that intertwined, but I mean, by the huge share is going to be civilians. Several thousand injured. And I was wrong. 13, not 14. 13 Jews were killed with a dozen or so injured. I don't know whether they were killed by the rocket strikes. Good chance in that, or maybe some of the Israeli Iron Dome, or I don't exactly know how that happened, but 72,000 Palestinians displaced, 300 Palestinians killed, only 13 Jews killed. So as you can see, the Israelis have a really like the Iron Dome, you mentioned it, super modern technology, military, arms, everything. Gaza and the West Bank, I mean,
they don't have any of that. They don't have.
They're decades behind.
Yeah.
In they use whatever they can. I've seen a picture of this someone had a stapler that they attached to like a revolver body, and that was like a gun, like a makeshift gun that could explode in your hand anytime. They're really using whatever they have to defend themselves and their families. So yeah. So I have a question for you. Was this a housing dispute? What these protests, these evictions that we're talking about? Are we really saying that a housing dispute led to these rockets and airstrikes? Is that what happened here?
So let me go more into detail about that. So in a statement on Friday, Israeli Foreign Ministry said Palestinian Authority and Palestinian terrorists were presenting a real estate dispute between private parties as a nationalistic cause in order to incite violence in Jerusalem.
Most real estate disputes that I'm aware of don't lead to rocket fire.
No, generally none of the ones that I know.
The housing in Seattle is pretty fucked, but
yeah, you don't have neighbors shooting rockets at each other. So.
We're close. I think we're almost there. Okay, so the Israeli Foreign Ministry claims it's a real estate dispute between private parties.
Yes, but the Palestinians say otherwise. They say that it is a wider effort to remove thousands of Palestinians from strategic areas in East Jerusalem.
Okay, so systematic removal of these people then is what they're claiming. Okay, and so this conflict between Israelis and Palestinians is not new. As you and I both know, it will likely happen again. I mean, part of me still thinks any night like things could happen. Ramadan is over, so I mean that was obviously a touchy subject, a touchy time for all this to be happening.
Granted, this has been, these conflicts have been going on for quite a while now, and it dates back almost 100 years ago.
Yeah. So I think we should go into why it could flare up at any time, really. Like, they're claiming it's just a housing dispute, but let's go back. Let's go way back here for a second.
Back to the beginning.
All right. So I think it kind of all starts prior to World War II a little bit. You want to start us off there?
Yeah. So started with British control, colonization. It was prior to World War II.
Kind of just like any other territory that the Brits controlled, really, right?
Yeah. Yep. So after World War I, the British gained control of a certain area. So did the French, and the British so happened to gain control over what at the time was Palestine.
And I believe the French had Algeria.
Correct. Yep. And Palestine wasn't just Arab Palestinians. It was 5% Muslims. There were Christians there.
Christians, Jews, Muslims. I mean,
everybody.
All the Abrahamic religions were there, and as far as I'm aware, it was mostly peaceful.
Yeah.
In 1947, as I understand it, the UN recognized Israel as a state, and simultaneously gave both Palestinians independence from British rule, and also basically gave Israel a state. So they're both saying Palestinians, you have independence, and then they're also saying Israel is now a state on the same piece of territory, which is most situations you would think that wouldn't work out. So they arbitrarily carved up Palestine into two states, one for Jews, one for Arabs. We should show a picture if we can, put up on the screen. But at some point, I mean, it's truly arbitrarily done. I mean, it looks like a jigsaw puzzle. It really does. Can you talk at all about the UN borders by any chance?
Yeah, so a lot of land that Israel was granted according to the UN borders was where Palestinians lived and worked for generations. Neighboring Arab states didn't basically like the colonialist land grab, so to speak. They just saw it as another, force of, the UN's views on us.
Just like how Africa was carved up.
Yeah.
Right? So just another. I mean, not just any land too, but sacred holy land just being essentially declared an Israeli state where they've been living and working for generations. Is what you're saying basically. These UN borders are purely arbitrary.
Mm-hmm. So, in response to that, in 1948, they started the Arab-Israeli War.
Okay.
Where Israel won, and
they always do.
Yeah.
They always do.
Yeah, and they gained more Palestinian land, past what the UN had recognized.
Okay, so these borders are arbitrary, and then they win the war, and now they have even more land, right? Okay. And so as I understand it, Palestinians were removed from their homes in a mass exodus following the war. And during the war, of course, when there's a war, you got to escape with your family. I mean, rockets and bombs and everything going off. So lots of Palestinians removed from their homes. What was once two states is now an Israeli state that effectively controls the Palestinian population. Would you believe that's a correct statement, essentially?
Yes.
In almost less than a decade after it's recognized as a state, right? In 1967, a second war known as the Six-Day War led to a stunning Israeli victory. Like I said, they always win. And their control over Gaza and the West Bank tightened. This is when illegal Israeli settlement started. Due to the belief that their military victory was a sign from God, that they deserved, they had the right to return to these holy lands. So, the Six-Day War is an incredible war as far as wars go.
It was a crazy feat for Israel.
Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq. Pretty much every Arab state you can think of was on the border of Israel, ready to annihilate it.
Yeah.
And they gained territory every day of the Six-Day War. So really a crazy war. And you can understand why they might think this is a sign from God. We deserve to be in the West Bank, which is a huge problem for the Palestinians living there, right?
Yeah.
So,
so settlements in Gaza have effectively been curbed by the Israeli government. But the West Bank is currently systematically developed and settled by Israelis with financial incentives and tax breaks.
They have tax breaks for people moving there then.
Yeah, well, it encourages people to move there. They don't just move there. Well, not everybody moves there for religious reasons. For a lot of people, they move there because it's affordable. Right? It's peaceful.
And the government is making this affordable.
Yeah, these people don't live in tents. They live in well-developed buildings, such as the one we're recording this podcast in right now. So
wow, Hollywood Hills.
Yeah, it's nice. But that essentially is making it possible for Palestinians to truly have their own independence or statehood. And the reason that's the case is because they have all these developed communities now. It's the further these develop, the more difficult it is for the Palestinians to get their land back.
I see. Okay. And this has been ongoing for a long time. To finish off the history recap, I think there's one other thing we need to talk about, which is the Oslo Accords from 2005. Now, the Oslo Accords divided the West Bank into three areas. For just to make it easier to talk about, let's just say Area A, Area B, and Area C. Area A is under Palestinian government and security control and marks a tiny little slice, a fraction of the desirable land of the West Bank. All the land with resources and water and everything is not Area A. Area B is under Palestinian government control, but under Israeli security control, which means essentially at any time, raids can be conducted by the Israeli government. They can go into any house, any building, and just force their way in, essentially. Roadblocks, you name it, anything of that sort. Area C, which makes up over half the West Bank, is under full Israeli control. Now we have a picture here, which we'll put up for our viewers, but take a look at that.
Yeah, this is a really good depiction over time as to what initially belonged to the Palestinians and what has over time become more Israeli Jewish.
Let me point out to the viewers, so the 1946 map, that is essentially, it's after World War II. Excuse me. It's after World War II, but it's before Israel is declared a state by the UN.
Yes.
So look at that. That's Palestine.
Yeah,
it's not
90%.
It's not. There is no Israel yet. Yeah. Palestinian families have been living and working in that area in those lands for generations. Now, 1947 happens. UN declares Israel state. Look at that.
Yeah, it goes from 90% Palestinian land to 50% Palestinian.
Look at that. If you zoom in on that. Look at those little tiny land bridges between those green segments.
Yeah.
In the blue set.
That's all they have to cross.
It's arbitrary. It's just a jigsaw. And then 1967, the Six-Day War.
Yeah.
Look at how much territory they gain. Look at how small Gaza gets in the left corner, and the West Bank shrinks.
Yeah.
And the upper north part completely taken over by Israel.
Yeah.
Now, 2005, Oslo Accords. Look at that. That green area right there is Area A.
Yeah.
Everything else, Israel.
Yeah, and that makes them so hard for them to travel between one of their territories from one to the other.
It's crazy to think about.
Yeah.
All right. So we've situated this human rights problem in its political social context. Let's get to the meat and potatoes. What is this situation like for Palestinians? We got to talk about like, job opportunities. Probably property seizures, demolitions, constricted movement, checkpoints. Let's talk about this.
Yeah. So let me actually ask you right off the bat then, what is the State Department's view of the human rights situation in
Okay, I'm
Israel?
glad you asked. And it actually surprised me when I was looking into this because, as you know, U.S., Israel, we're allies. According to the State Department, the situation in Israel and Palestine involves significant human rights issues, including arbitrary killings, arbitrary detention, restrictions on Palestinians residing in Jerusalem, including this arbitrary, unlawful interference with privacy, family, home. They're prevented from freedom of association, even like which groups they belong to. There are significant restrictions on their freedom of movement. There's often violence against asylum seekers. And there's labor rights abuses against foreign workers and Palestinians from the West Bank. So these Palestinians in the West Bank who often have to travel out of the West Bank for jobs because, again, there's almost no opportunity for these people living in the West Bank. There are labor rights and abuses against these people. So it's a tough situation. And that's all according to the State Department, which, again, usually is very careful with their words.
So a good example here, as you're saying, in violation, is when Israeli security forces placed Al-Arbid in solitary confinement and transferred him to an interrogation center in Jerusalem.
And Al-Arbid is he's not like a special senator or he's just a random person, a normal guy, just like you or me, living with his family or whatever, and he was picked up, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
So 2 days later, he was admitted to a hospital, unconscious and with serious injuries. So this implies there was
Special interrogation techniques, perhaps.
yes, possibly physical, including the inability to breathe.
He couldn't breathe on his own.
Yeah.
Wow.
No, he had kidney failure, broken ribs.
All of that from 2 days of interrogation.
Correct.
Wow. And this is just some guy. This isn't even.
Yeah,
this isn't even someone who belongs to a particular group, really.
This is average day-to-day citizen. This isn't some political leader. This isn't some terrorist. This is just some random dude.
Wow, that is really crazy to hear. Kidney failure, broken ribs, inability to breathe. Wow. Well, so to continue on this arbitrary arrest and policing, according to NGOs and Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem, they've actually been alleging that security forces disproportionately devote what they call enforcement actions. It's really just raids, seizures. So they allege that security forces are disproportionately devoting these enforcement actions to Palestinian neighborhoods. They have temporary checkpoints and raids at higher levels in West Jerusalem, so West Jerusalem is where many of these Palestinians reside that haven't been evicted yet. And so Palestinians have also criticized the police for devoting fewer resources on a per capita basis to combating regular crime. So essentially, what they're saying is police, and this is a direct quote from one of their groups there on the ground. Police did not maintain a permanent presence in areas of Jerusalem outside the barrier, and only entered to conduct raids, according to many of these NGOs.
Correct. Yes.
So that'd be like if the Seattle Police Department lived in Bothell and didn't prevent crime, didn't turn a blind eye to everything, and only entered Seattle to just raid your house or to set up a checkpoint or to check what you're search your car as you're driving. That's crazy.
Yeah. Well, how does that, first of all, how does that make you feel as a resident of Bothell? It makes you feel... They don't care about you and they care about somebody else. And then how would that make you feel if you were being patrolled by somebody who has no govern over you?
It makes you feel like you're not even in your own country at that point.
Yeah.
which is great. I mean, yeah, I mean, these people don't have anywhere else to go. I mean, all the border states, Syria, Jordan, they already have a ton of refugees. The conditions, you can't just like hop the border and hope that you're gonna have a great life. There's no such opportunity for these people. These arbitrary arrests, this sort of policing where you're not even there to stop crime, you're there just to literally just raid these people.
Yeah, you could be a kid picking berries in a field and they don't like where you're picking them, and say Israelis come in, they want to pick berries as well, and they see you there. Well, all of a sudden you find yourself arrested.
Wow.
And in an indefinite, detainment.
Wow. And yeah, I mean, imagine you're growing up. Imagine you're growing up in this kind of environment where the only people you can rely on are like, perhaps gangs even. Like if the police aren't even there to enforce any sense of law and order, they're only there to check you as if you're a terrorist. What is that? How does a kid growing up in that kind of area, turn out? Like, I mean, these people, they have only themselves to rely on, really.
Well, this is where groups like Hamas come into play, and they govern their people. They aren't just a military group. They provide aid. Granted, some of the things they do are extreme in a sense.
Yeah. Well. Yeah. Exactly.
But there's some legitimacy behind a group like that, and this group, would have never come to fruition. They wouldn't have to if something like this didn't exist.
I mean, it almost makes me think of the chicken and egg problem, where Israel is treating these people, this is the land their ancestors, they've lived on for generations. They're treating them in a certain way. They're giving them no option but to try to rebel, but to protest, but to try to get the international community involved. And when they do that, every once in a while, just as with the Black Lives Matter protests, there's one person who loots. All of a sudden, everyone's a rioter.
Everyone's a rioter. Yeah.
So, I mean, and it's the same thing here. So it's the actions, in my view, by the Israeli government are really encouraging this to happen. They're creating their own problem for themselves, right?
Yeah.
And so these kind of arbitrary arrests and stuff, they're impacting these Palestinian families day to day. Their very livelihood. It's a significant issue, and I think it interacts with their housing, like these evictions we're talking about, their freedom of movement. I don't think you can isolate any of this stuff. When they have these checkpoints that control where you go, you can't even get to work unless you have a certain ID. The ID, it takes months to get the ID, and while you're there, you're like the State Department said, there's labor abuses.
Yeah.
Or
and then you could go into housing and evictions. How hard it is to get a permit.
Yeah.
And we'll go more in depth in that here in a moment.
Oh, we will. Yeah. Let's pivot. Let's take a deeper dive into this housing and eviction situation impacting Palestinians. Now, as I understand it, there was a video that you wanted our viewers to take a listen to, take a look at. Let's pull that up real quick.
All right.
Also, can I top you off with a little more?
I appreciate
a little more wine. This isn't sponsored. This isn't sponsored by any means, but Josh Cabernet Sauvignon by Josh Sellers, very good. As you know, I like to get our go ahead and pass that to me. I like to get our guests loose-lipped before we talk about the big issues impacting those of the world. No inhibitions allowed.
Only the truth and nothing but the truth.
All right, so let's get that video pulled up. This for me?
All right. All right, let me know when you're ready.
All right, let's go for it.
All right. So here you see just absolute destruction. It's just straight up vandalism. This was somebody's home.
Yeah, this is very frugal. I mean, it looks like a bomb went off.
Yeah, and if you could see what the Israelis' homes look like in comparison to the Palestinians, Israeli live in well-developed communities. We're talking 2-3 story homes here.
Yeah, I mean they really have like nothing here. It looks like these are tents that were just what, bulldozed over or something.
Yeah. So here you've got this guy basically explaining that the intention of the Israelis destroying their homes are just simply to displace the Palestinians. That's their
Control where they can be, where they can
Exactly.
exist in their own state.
Exactly.
Okay. And I'm assuming it's so that these areas can either be used for military purposes, maybe mining, oil, like
Correct.
any number of just housing for Israelis. Like they're just being moved.
Yeah. So it means all the it's all the above. They want the land and they get all the economic benefits with the land.
Wow, that is wow. I mean, that's a really shocking look at what it actually is like for the average family, though. That's a interesting video. I mean, I didn't even see any running water or electricity.
No, villages often lack basic water, electricity, and they're subject to sudden demolition.
And that probably goes back to the Oslo Accords, Area
Yeah.
A, Area B, Area C.
Yeah.
As I understand it, a lot of the valuable land with resources and water was not ever given to Palestinians.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it started off with the Palestinians being kicked off of their land as the Israel state is created, right? And then they win the wars, and then they get even more land.
Okay.
And so now, really, what happened is from when there were the UN and the international community wanted 2 states. Now there is like a 0.1 of a state, and they're being still evicted, kicked out, moved, displaced, all along their territory, given the worst opportunities.
Yep, and we can go back to Area C, and who's really in charge here? They put the Israeli government in charge. Is this really Palestinian land?
Yeah. Well, let me read off this real quick fact. 2,241 demolitions, and this video, by the way, I forget if we mentioned it. Bedouin is Israelis, and so these are Palestinians. They're Bedouins, and 2,241 demolitions of their houses, tents, anywhere that they can live. Right. So this demolition policy is clearly violating the Bedouins' right to adequate housing. I mean, clearly,
Absolutely.
clearly. Let's get back to the State Department.
Okay.
Which I was surprised at the information the State Department was giving, considering that it is an ally. So, I mean, it makes you wonder. But a 2017 law increased the government's power to demolish unpermitted structures. So, relatively new, relatively recent thing. And new construction, all the meanwhile, remained illegal in towns that did not have an authorized plan for development. Now, what's interesting is that the areas that were deemed illegal for new construction, unauthorized, didn't have an authorized plan for development, were almost always like Arab areas. So Arab villages, towns, neighborhoods, right? So essentially, there's a systematic housing shortage in Arab communities. They're not allowed to build new structures, and meanwhile, they're being evicted or having their houses demolished. So, according to various human rights organizations, approximately 50,000 Arab families lived in unpermitted houses. And every week, the number gets smaller as they're evicted, demolished, whatever.
Yeah. And some NGOs, such as mine, we strongly criticize the lack of Arab representation.
Is there any? Or, is it almost nothing?
Hardly. There's hardly any representation on regional planning and zoning. Approval.
Even though this is directly impacting them.
Yes.
Their livelihood, their ability to have a family in these areas.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And they also stated that planning for Arab areas is much slower from Jewish municipalities, which leads Arab citizens to build or expand their homes without legal authorization.
They have no choice, really.
No, they can't, because they can't obtain these permits to build their housing in the first place. So, and not risk the government-issued demolition order. And then the authorities issued approximately 1,800 administrative and judicial demolition orders during last year.
During a single year?
Correct.
1,800. That could be, so for all those orders, I mean, most of those are probably against a whole family.
Yeah. Yeah, these are, you know...
It's not just 1,800 people. Those are 1,800 orders for a demolition.
Yeah, and some of these are multi-family dwellings. They aren't just single-family dwellings.
Wow, that's unbelievable.
Yeah. And there are cases, demolitions with no agreement for the residents to relocate.
They just have nowhere to go.
No, they're homeless, essentially. And the government levied fines against residents to cover costs of demolitions.
Wow. Wow. They fined them in addition to that.
Yeah.
They said, you're homeless now, and we're going to fine you. And also, we don't care where you end up.
Yeah, and that's not it. You know, they asserted that there was a continuing policy intent limit to construction in order to prevent the creation or maintenance of continuous neighborhoods.
That seems to be a recurring theme where government funding, support, however you want to call it, really only reaches Israeli areas. And so these demolitions, building by building, tent by tent, house by house, these Palestinian people are having their property taken away from them and not even allowed to create new property in those areas. So they're being forced out of Jerusalem. They're being forced out of these areas. They're being evicted, and what do? They just have to travel away. They have either become homeless, or
they either have to go to a different location and find a way to build a home. They either have to live illegally, or they just don't live at all. They're homeless.
With presumably the areas that they're allowed to go to or able to go to are less desirable areas with very little resources, if any.
Yeah, that's if they can even get there.
Okay, again, that was from the State Department. Now, I think it's, on this podcast, as you know, I like to have multiple different lenses, perspectives on any issue. So for this next bit, let's both take a look at this report from Amnesty International. Let's have it pulled up for you right here. And Amnesty International, as far as I can tell, a lot of what this document that we're going to be taking a look at, it corroborates and actually expands further into much of what the State Department reported on and what many of these NGOs, including the one you work for, are saying. So let's take a look at it. Anything jump out at you immediately?
So the first section that jumps out at me, and I'll quote this, is Israel continued to impose institutionalized discrimination against Palestinians living under its rule in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, OPT. It displaced hundreds of Palestinians in Israel and the occupied West Bank and Jerusalem as a result of home demolitions and imposition of other coercive measures.
Just to break in there real quick, we have video. Mm-hmm. We watched that video. We have the State Department admitting it happens.
Yes.
Amnesty International. So this is something that there really is. It's blatantly happening.
Yeah.
For the whole international community to be aware of, that these people who have lived here, worked there as much as they can for generations, are being forced out systematically.
Correct.
According to all these sources, mm-hmm. video, anything you can think of. Yeah. This is happening. Yeah. It's a direct violation of their human rights.
Yeah. And then in response, they retaliate, and then they take that
they
retaliation
protest,
as an excuse to fight back.
They protest. They do it. They do whatever, and then 72,000 Palestinians are displaced in less than a week.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, if we keep looking at this, Israeli forces continue to use excessive force during law enforcement activities in Israel and the OPT.
Okay.
Israeli forces killed 31 Palestinians, including 9 children, in the OPT. Many were unlawfully killed while posing no imminent threat to life. Israel maintained its illegal blockade on the Gaza Strip.
They're blockading it.
Yes, subjecting its residents to collective punishment and deepening the humanitarian crisis. It also continued to restrict freedom of movement of Palestinians in the OPT through checkpoints and roadblocks.
Okay, so we're hitting on a lot of key things here that I think later on we'll really hit on. I have some documents prepared, but freedom of movement, rights to property, rights to housing, rights to basic travel, access, movement through your own country, right? Those are all things that I think we're going to have to hit on a little bit later. Now, according to this report that I'm taking a look at again, I'm looking at the same report as you. Close to 1,000 Palestinian residential structures, close to a whole 1,000 Palestinian residential structures were demolished due to them lacking these Israeli-issued permits. Now, these permits, as I understand it, are virtually impossible for Palestinians to get. So they're being demolished because they don't have these permits. They can't get these permits. Whereas it's been reported from these NGOs, including Amnesty International, it takes sometimes days, occasionally weeks, for Israeli Jews to easily receive these permits to develop on these lands.
Yeah.
So the government is essentially not issuing these permits, demolishing these structures, waiting a week or two, giving a permit to an Israeli family and saying, you can access this. You can now develop this land.
So this is why Israelis are living on such developed communities, because they have the ability and they know that these structures are going to be permanent, first of all. Second of all, they have the funding to do so. And they also have the permitting, so they can get...
They get tax breaks even, right?
Yeah.
I read that teachers who choose to move to the West Bank, settle there, illegally, really, they get a higher paycheck than teachers who are teaching in Israel.
Yeah, and Israelis have got to really realize here that yes, it is less expensive to live over there. Yes, they do get tax breaks, but at what cost? They're pushing people out of their homes. How would you feel if you were pushed out of your home?
Yeah, exactly.
Just for someone to demolish it and build their own. So, another section here that I'd like to point out is for the 13th consecutive year, Israel continued its illegal air, land, and sea blockade of the Gaza Strip, restricting movement of people and goods in and out of the area, which continued to have a devastating impact on the human rights of Gaza's 2 million inhabitants. And this also includes, economic struggles, because if they're restricting, people, goods, how are they able to develop a stable economic environment?
They're choking the local economy
Exactly.
of these people. And that, I'm assuming that includes anything from building materials, anything that they would need to develop a mobilized economy, anything of that sort. It makes you wonder why they would fire rockets at you.
Yeah, well, this is why the rockets are so underdeveloped.
I wonder why they're angry.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder.
Yeah. So Israel stopped the entry of construction materials and fuel into Gaza repeatedly, as we just said, was shut down the only power plant in Gaza.
You're telling me a single power plant is all that exists in Gaza?
Correct.
Wow. I mean, it's hard for us to imagine the scale that these Palestinian people are truly just not having a chance at a healthy, developed life.
Yeah.
They're being choked in their own they're being evicted and moved and controlled and just pushed away, and where they are allowed to settle, even then they're still controlled. Even then, I mean, Area B was much larger than Area A.
Mm-hmm.
The amount of area that Palestinians had, yes, they had authority or whatever, but they at any moment you could be raided, have your car taken from you for random purposes, whatever. These people are not given a chance at a life.
And Israel also imposed a full maritime closure and repeatedly limited entry of goods to food and medicine only. And this expands on our economic issues that Gaza's having. So the measures amounted to collective punishment at a time of increased COVID-19 infections in Gaza. So they're not able to have the supplies necessary to combat COVID-19 in Gaza.
And I'm sure that's still affecting them right now. I mean, there's a fair amount of Americans have been vaccinated at this point of the podcast as of June 5th. But I mean, I mean, I bet almost none are vaccinated there, and they're still having this blockade. Still cannot get anything, any of these materials, resources. They were just bombed.
Yeah.
You know, if COVID wasn't enough, they've been bombed, airstriked, you know, whatever, and now they don't even have enough resources or medicine or food or whatever, probably. So, yeah, okay. It seems to me that these evictions and demolitions are pretty obviously targeted. You know, State Department, Amnesty International, we've watched some videos. This systematic removal of Palestinians from their own land, I mean, it's blatantly obvious. And this in itself is a human rights problem, but it's not the whole story. We've touched on this a bit with these blockades, these checkpoints, you know, roadblocks. But the freedom of movement of the Palestinian people within their own country is also being violated. So yes, these evictions, these demolitions, these property seizures, huge human rights issue. But so is the freedom of movement, and they're interconnected. So they're second-class citizens within their own country. I mean, really. And so I want to talk about the 2003 Law of Citizenship and Entry. It's been renewed annually ever since 2003, and it prohibits Palestinians from the West Bank or Gaza, including those who are, you know, Palestinian spouses, from obtaining resident status. So you cannot be a resident unless the Ministry of the Interior makes a special determination, usually on humanitarian grounds. Now, typically, there are very few of these special determinations, as they call them. So the people who work in Israel, I mean, these Palestinian families who work in Israel, they're not residents. They're not allowed to. They have to every day travel a couple hours to Israel, to like an Israeli city, and every day travel a couple hours back to their home. They're not granted resident status. And the government, like I said, has extended the law annually due to government reports that the Palestinian family reunification allows entry to a disproportionate number of persons who are later involved in acts of terrorism. Now, again, this goes back to the chicken and the egg problem. If you treat people like they're a terrorist group, you don't provide policing, you don't combat crime, you don't give them resources like basic running water, electricity, they're going to get mad.
Yeah.
They're going to get very mad. And so, you know, if you let people be residents, just like we talked about, you know, for every Black Lives Matter protest, there's going to be one person in the crowd of thousands who's going to try looting.
Yep, and then everyone is going to become rioters.
And so the government essentially is justifying this law, this 2003 law, by saying that it allows terrorists into the country. Well, that's really their problem, in my opinion. But yeah, so I mean, let's take a deep dive into this freedom of movement. I mean, I have a video that I prepared from the perspective of residents living in this area. So let's take a look at this. And I was shocked by this video. I really was. This is a high school student.
College student, average civilians.
Just regular people.
Yeah.
Just to bring in money for their families.
Yeah, no, they're simply asking what to them is freedom of movement.
They can't even travel, you know, outside of the country.
Yeah. So this particular high school graduate, 19, Mohammed Khazer, here he's bringing up almost economic struggles here. He's saying he'd like to be able to bring in goods, for instance, if someone wants something, which shows that he has no ability to do so.
Well, as you and I both know, any basic economy that involves trade requires the ability to trade.
Yeah.
You have to be able to move past
yeah.
borders to
Yeah.
trade. And it seems like, I mean, again, yeah, this freedom of movement issue that is impacting
Yeah.
these people. This is the land that they've been slowly pushed into darker and darker corners, smaller and smaller areas. But even then, they aren't allowed to really travel outside those areas without special permits.
Mhm.
And even then, rarely.
Yeah.
They cannot do basic trade or anything. I mean, these high school kids are talking about, what would you do if you could travel? I would bring in goods for my family. I mean,
Yeah.
that's crazy. Let's take another. Let's keep going.
See, here he brings up an interesting point. This is infrastructure here that they're lacking because they can't bring in, modern technology. Like,
We talked about how construction equipment and
Yeah.
materials were just not allowed
Yeah.
past the blockade.
for example, how often do you use your phone
Oh, too often.
per day, right?
Too often.
Well, these people don't have access to the kind of cell service we have, right? They don't have that advanced technology that the rest of the world does.
He's talking about hospitals even. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a basic
Yeah,
need.
he doesn't even
That's a
have-
basic
Yeah.
human need, and they can't even, I mean, it's crazy. He's a medical student. I mean, wow.
There's another issue. She is complaining that she doesn't have electricity and water all the time. Imagine waking up in the morning, not being able to turn on the light and go, oh, well, it's not 8:30 yet, so I can't turn on the water or light yet.
Yeah. Wow.
It's not that I choose not to, it's that it's not available.
And I'm assuming you've probably seen situations like this while you were in Israel.
There are times where it's not just, an hour or two. There's days, weeks, sometimes months that they don't have access to water and electricity.
Wow. Here he's talking about the siege, the blockade,
Mhm.
right? So I mean, it's affecting everyone. It's not just on certain, materials and stuff. I mean, every single person, all 2 million people living in this tiny little square of land in the south of this territory, they're all affected.
Alright, so that's pretty much the end of the video.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that? That is what's going on in the ground
I mean,
in Gaza.
I was really touched by that video. We saw a huge range of people from all walks of life, asking for basic things that most of us take for granted. And it's completely preventable. There's really no security reason. There's no real good reason Israel has to do this. Stopping medical supplies, preventing running electricity or water, or just basic construction materials. There's nothing that doing that benefits Israel. Why are they doing this? I mean, it makes you wonder. I mean, it's crazy. If you take a wide look at it, you take a step back from this issue. I mean, it's not like these people. It's an ongoing conflict, yes, but it's not like these people are out seeking the destruction of Israel by any means. They're just trying to have basic needs met.
Trying to survive here.
Yeah. So it's a little crazy to me. I mean, these things that we take for granted, like a working passport or being able to visit your family who lives a handful of miles outside of town. Like imagine if your own government which was forced onto you, by the way. Right? These people didn't ask for an Israeli government to control the kind of access to materials and resources or travel they have. Imagine this government that you didn't elect prevented you at every step of the way from a quality of life. And that's everyday reality for these people, millions of people. The very land and property they cling onto is being taken from them step by step, day by day. So that's why this issue is so crazy for me. That's why that video was so touching, really, to me. Now, the elephant in the room. Why are Israelis settling in the West Bank? What do they have to gain? I mean, the international community, for the most part, is either neutral or against it.
Yeah.
What are they? What is exactly in their minds making all this worth it? Yeah. This pain and suffering they're inflicting on the Palestinian people. Why are they going through with it?
So we touched on this a little bit earlier, at least with the tax break part of it, but it's more than that. There are three main reasons: religious, political, and the fact that it's inexpensive to live there. So there's a tacit support of illegal settlements. Government is set up.
Tacit support by the Israeli government?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And this government, Israeli government, has set up garbage routes, water lines, electricity, cell service, in areas with illegal settlements, everything that the Palestinians in Gaza are lacking.
They're setting up for these completely.
Yeah.
It's illegal on an international level.
Oh yeah.
Even, but these settlements, they're providing garbage routes.
Yeah.
All this stuff
everything
that they could ever need, and then after a certain level of development, once too much money has been invested, then all of a sudden it's not illegal anymore. Or they declare it's not illegal. They say this is no longer illegal.
It just becomes impossible for, and the world sees this, it becomes impossible for Palestinians to resettle because that would require the evictions of the Israeli people. And that's just, yeah. Okay. It's like way back when the British came to the U.S. and all the Indians, right? And then all this U.S. All of us people settled, right?
Yeah.
Technically, in some people's eyes, in a lot of people's eyes, realistically, it belongs to the Native Americans. Now, how hard is it right now for us, every U.S. citizen, to leave and the Native Americans give their land back? It's impossible.
Impossible.
Billions, right?
Way of life has already been structured. And,
yeah.
And you told me this before the podcast when we were chatting. But you told me this, once a year they demolish a random illegal settlement. They take pictures of it. They make a big deal of it.
Yep.
And they try to create a narrative of a hardline stance against these illegal settlements. Mm-hmm. But in reality, they're creating these garbage routes, water lines, electricity, cell service. And then every once in a while they destroy a single one and put it on the news.
This is just for the media. Yep. This is just to show that, hey, we're taking action against our people who are illegally moving into these settlements, when right behind the picture, the one building they destroyed probably needed to be destroyed, probably wasn't suitable for living. Behind them, there are condominiums, there are full 5-6-story houses,
Hollywood
colleges,
Hills,
education,
in the West Bank.
Basically, yeah. And they use that picture as an excuse, saying we're cracking down on illegal settlement.
Meanwhile, even the very tents that Palestinians are living in are being demolished.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, well, for this next segment, I feel free to chime in whenever you want to, but it is pretty legal matters. So it's really, I'm going to be focusing on a couple different documents on how Israelis, basic human rights are being violated in terms of international human rights.
International law, and I should be able to interject with, pretty much prime examples of this. If not, examples we've already given.
Which we've given many,
yes.
But let me start off with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR. Now, Israel has signed this document. They signed it in 1966, before the Six-Day War. They ratified it October 3rd in 1991, so it took a couple of decades. And it was finally enforced on January 3rd, 1992. Now, I want to talk about a couple... There are 3 articles that I think are important in this ICCPR document. Article 12. Section 1. Everyone lawfully within the territory of a state shall, within that territory, have the right to liberty of movement and freedom to choose his residence.
Which the Palestinians do not.
Yeah, we've looked at that from every angle. We've looked at that from the U.S. government, from NGOs, from like on the ground video footage.
Clear violation.
Clear violation of their liberty of movement and freedom to choose residence. We've talked about the permits that they need, and they're not ever being granted to. So they can't even choose their residence, right, in their own country. In Section 2, everyone shall be free to leave any country, including his own.
We go back to the video there when they wish they could travel.
That high school kid was basically asking like for a working passport.
But he's not permitted, and that is in clear violation of Article 12, Section 2.
I agree. Article 9 of the ICCPR, Section 1. No one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest or detention. You told us about that story. The guy who literally kidney failure, couldn't breathe, like just broken ribs. I mean, it is obvious. It is obvious to I think both of us that there is completely arbitrary arrest and detention.
Yeah,
and these people can be held for long periods of time because of this renewal of this law that allows them to be kept almost indefinitely.
Yeah.
So, Section 3. Anyone arrested or detained on a criminal charge shall be brought promptly before a judge. Again, they are renewing these laws that are supposedly anti-terrorist, but they're being used against just everyday everyday Palestinians. So, I mean, they are not brought promptly before a judge. They're interrogated for months and then brought before a judge with a forced confession, often.
Yeah.
Article 14, the last article I want to talk about from the ICCPR. All persons shall be equal before the courts and tribunals. That's obviously not happening. The rate of these demolitions, the rate of these permits, who they're being given to, the areas where buildings are being deemed illegal, all against Palestinians, all in the favor of Israeli Jews. Yeah, I mean, these. It's just very obvious to me that these courts are very biased against the Palestinian people. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, what is this? This is the. This is like the fourth different way that international human rights, that not just international human rights that Israel has signed into law and enforced are being violated. These very laws that Israel has agreed to, this is the fourth section that they're violating, right? And there's also Article 14, Section 1, or Section 2, Part C, to be tried without undue delay. Like we've mentioned, they've been held for months.
Yeah, this goes back to the indefinite detention of Palestinian citizens, right? So that strictly goes against the to be tried without undue delay, because what is that delay? Indefinite? It's an indefinite delay.
And again, I want to stress, this is not just any international human rights law. This is human rights law Israel has signed, has ratified, has enforced, has agreed for everyone living within its borders to make sure is upheld. And it's completely, clearly violating it.
Correct.
Let's move on to another international human rights document, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the ICESC. Now, there's only one article that I want to bring up from this. Now, this article, before we get into it, was signed in 1966, December 19th, again, before the Six-Day War, and it was enforced, again, nearly 3 decades later, October 3rd, 1991. So, Article 11. The states parties to the present covenant recognize the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, including adequate food, clothing, and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. The states parties will take appropriate steps to ensure the realization of this right, recognizing to this effect the essential importance of international cooperation based on free consent. There are about 7 different ways, just reading off that I can say, are being violated.
All of them are being violated. I don't know a single one that they're permitted to. I mean, we'll start at the beginning here. Everyone has the right to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family. Families are getting evicted. I mean, that is a clear violation.
Adequate food. That's being controlled. There's a blockade.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying that they're preventing all food from traveling through the border. I'm just saying that it's monitored, it's enforced, it's controlled. It's not up to them.
Yeah. And then the second one, clothing and housing. Well, clothing, again, economic. And second one, very clear, housing. Right?
Housing is a huge issue. I mean,
it's a primary issue.
I mean, and we kind of glossed over it earlier, but these multi-family housing units aren't because people just want to live with 40 other people in a room. Mm-hmm. They have no other choice. You know? Yeah. I mean, it's And
then here the last section, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. It's not continuous improvement.
They're not allowed to even construct or build.
Yeah.
They're only being demolished and not allowed to construct.
Yeah.
So I agree with that.
It's continuing to decline.
Let's pivot once again. Have you ever heard of Amartya Sen?
I've not.
Okay. Amartya Sen is an Indian philosopher and economist. And he talks a lot about development and how development interacts with freedom. And the reason why I'm pivoting to this real quickly is because, you know, we've seen in the videos how Palestinians are systematically losing large swaths of territory, housing, economic opportunities, you name it really, such as lands with resources, agriculture that no longer belong to them. I mean, everything that is valuable in the West Banks is being stripped away slowly. So I want to pivot to Amartya Sen because of how much it matters to the freedom and liberty of the Palestinian people. I mean, development is a great thing, but it's also necessary for freedom, I think. You know, and so I want to talk a little bit about the musings, the thoughts, the writings of Amartya Sen, who, like I said, is an Indian philosopher and economist, and he wrote a book called "Development as Freedom." Development as Freedom. And I want to draw on some of his insights to highlight the importance of what is happening in the West Bank and the illegal settlements that is going on there. So, Sen characterizes development as a process of expanding the real freedoms that people enjoy. So he points to how healthcare, education, social order all exist easier in developed countries, you know? Hospitals, basic stuff like that, basic infrastructure needed. You know, in a developed country, it's just easier. You can meet those needs of more people. It's no longer just the elites that have access to that. It's a basic need that is met. And how what people can achieve in their life is influenced by the economic opportunity, political liberty, and good health. So he's drawing a direct connection between development and freedom. We often think of development as its own thing, you know. You can have a highly developed nation that is authoritarian, right? You can have very little freedom, still be highly developed. Mm-hmm. But the way that Amartya Sen is characterizing it is that in order to have freedom, you must have development, right?
Okay.
At least in the modern world.
Yeah.
So I think the biggest takeaway I got from reading Sen's book, which again I highly recommend it. And the book is called Development as Freedom. I want to say that again. But the biggest takeaway I got is that other forms of freedom, like political freedom, civil freedom, cultural freedom, cannot exist without a basic form of economic freedom.
None of which the Palestinians have.
Correct. So it seems to me that the Israeli settlement of the West Bank, the blockade of Gaza, in that sense, is a direct infringement on the dignity and human rights of the Palestinian people.
No. And therefore preventing political freedom, civil freedom, and cultural freedom.
All sorts. So what we're seeing in the West Bank is not it's not necessarily some brutal massacre, like a war, nor is it an obvious genocide like what happened in Rwanda, but it's an indifference to the economic wellness, basic health, and opportunities of Palestinians living there. It's a complete indifference to how their lives are. Like we talked about, the police don't exist there to control crime. They're there to raid. They only cross the checkpoints to go in for a raid. It's an indifference to their way of life. The West Bank, we talk about this, looks like Hollywood Hills in some of the areas with Israelis. I mean, truly, looks like tennis courts, beautiful universities.
Developed infrastructure.
Completely developed infrastructure. But for the Arabs living there, close by, it's as if the very chance of a safe and prosperous life is slowly being diminished and choked away. And so I think that was why I wanted to bring up the Amartya Sen, because I want to stress to all the viewers who are listening right now that this development issue is actually a human rights issue as well. It impacts their freedom movement. It impacts their housing. It impacts all the aspects of their life. The opportunities they're given, the job opportunities, everything. I mean, when you're thinking about a single human rights issue, nothing exists in a vacuum. It's all impacted by other factors. And so in that sense, I wanted to bring into the discussion how development is really crucial for these people and how it's not being offered. Well, we got to be a little careful in time here, but I want to quickly talk about two other things. First, let's talk about U.S. arms sales, maybe tacit support for what Israel is doing. And let's finish up with, a call to action and like U.S. policy.
Okay,
right?
Let's do it.
So, as we both know, the U.S. is a long-term ally of Israel. We sell them a lot of weapons. And, the question is this tacit support for what they're doing? We're selling them these weapons at, discounted rates often. And, every once in a while we give them a stern warning. We don't actually do anything,
Yeah.
So what does this mean?
So here we have an article from Reuters saying, and here's a summary, is that the same week Israel committed airstrikes on dozens of Palestinian buildings, killing over 60 children. Biden approved an additional $735 million of weapons sales to Israel.
The same week.
Same week.
The same week that all those airstrikes were knocking over
buildings, hospitals.
I mean, they were even knocking over just straight up reporters' buildings, like people who are reporting on the issue.
Journalists.
Just journalists are being targeted.
Yeah.
Clearly. $735 million of weapons sales. Wow. Sounds like a military-industrial complex to me.
Yeah.
I would. How do you feel about this? Would you argue the U.S. is complicit in this violence if they're selling weapons to a country that has consistently demonstrated a lack of care for the citizens in its borders?
I don't think it's justified.
I don't either. I think the U.S. isn't doing enough, considering what it's offering to Israel. I want to quickly bring up weapons sales and grants. So Austin, who is who is the fucking best, he brought up some information ahead of time for us to take a look at. Feel free to take a look at it yourself. So according to this document, Israel is one of the United States' largest arms importers. In the past decade, the United States has sold to Israel over $7 billion in weaponry and military equipment. Like we talked about, $762 million through direct commercial sales, and a lot more through foreign military sales. And it looks like Israel is so devoted to U.S. military hardware that it has the world's largest fleet of F-16s outside the U.S. So as you and I both know, F-16s are advanced fighter jets capable of engaging in airstrikes, heavy munitions, drops. They're tactical fighters. They can do a lot of different things. They're actually they're using a lot of different roles, but they're expensive planes and they're relatively new. And so Israel has the largest fleet other than the U.S. So it goes to show a lot of the gear that Israel is using, a lot of the weapons is a direct result of the U.S. selling it to them. So, I mean, for me, that's complicity. That's being complicit in the issue. The U.S. has also underwritten Israel's domestic armaments industry by giving $1.3 billion to develop certain aircraft, $200 million to develop a certain tank, and 130 million to develop the high energy laser anti-missile system, which I think is supposed to complement the Iron Dome. So, from what this sounds like, the U.S. is providing a significant portion of what Israel uses to subjugate Palestinians.
Correct.
Through sales.
Yep. So the U.S. says they have no part and they have no jurisdiction.
And they put their foot down and say, hey, stop doing that, you know?
Yeah, well, we're no better than they are because we're giving them the weapons.
And we like you said, the same exact week that 60 children died in these airstrikes, the U.S. didn't change a thing.
Yeah. In fact, they gave them more weapons.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would think it's fair to say the U.S. is not doing enough in the situation that it is. Being the long-term ally, being one of the few, maybe perhaps international actors that Israel would actually respond to and listen to. So, we have talked about a lot in the last hour plus, right? I'm curious what your opinion on the matter is. I mean, about all of this, but about this whole issue. But I think I want to, for the viewers at home, quickly, state my own. So, from everything that I have taken a look at, all sides, all issues, it seems to me that there are both financial and political incentives for the Israeli government to turn a blind eye or to even encourage these illegal settlements. These illegal settlements are not happening by accident, It's tacit support by the Israeli government. And it seems to me that the Israeli government does not care about these property seizures. They're encouraging it, doing it themselves, and they're essentially just curbing the freedom of movement of Palestinians. And that seems all very obvious to me from the documents we looked at, the international human rights documents we took a look at, the videos, Amnesty International, even the U.S., an ally of Israel, the State Department. I mean, there are both financial and political incentives for the Israeli government to just let this happen.
Yeah. And politics in Israel is dominated by the Zionist parties. Compared to other countries, the number of parties contesting Knesset elections is relatively high.
And for those listening, the Knesset is pretty much their parliament.
Yep. And that has resulted in a fragmented legislature where smaller parties have representation in the Knesset, and no party has the 60-plus seat majority needed to form a government on its own because the Zionist parties do.
Yeah. And so on the political right, as I understand it, one of the biggest, perhaps, parties is Gush Emunim, which is Israeli nationalists advocating Jewish populating, aka settlement, of Judea and Samaria, which is, Judea and Samaria are in the Bible, but it's the West Bank.
Yeah.
And also a little bit of the Gaza Strip. And they're opposing evacuation of any of these communities. So essentially they're saying, nope, Israelis need to settle these areas, and it's our right through the Bible to settle these areas.
Religious reasons.
Yeah.
So the other on the political right is called the Yesha Council. Yesha being Hebrew for Judea, Samaria, Gaza. It's a loose formation of local office bearers in the occupied territories who represent the interests of the Israeli settlers in the West Bank.
Okay. So we've talked about these two groups. Now, as I understand it, due to a mix of these nationalist aspirations, right, for Israel, as well as these Zionist aspirations, these religiously motivated reasons, in addition to all those, into those two reasons, there's a lot of anti-Arab sentiment. Israel has been through many, many wars with Arab countries. I mean, in over the last hour we've talked about 3, but there's been more. And that has definitely created an anti-Arab sentiment. And also due to the value of resources and land in the West Bank, right? The majority of Israeli coalition governments either tacitly support or openly support settlement of the West Bank, despite international condemnation. So like I said, there's nationalism, there's Zionism, there's anti-Arab sentiment, there's value of resources. All of these reasons due to the fact that the Knesset requires so many different parties, right? Is that there's so many different reasons for the Knesset, for the parties in the Knesset, to allow this to happen.
Mm-hmm.
That's why it's been happening consistently over and over again for decades.
Yep.
And that's why there's really no reason to think that it will stop anytime soon, unless the international community gets involved. Which brings me to policy recommendations, really. So, in my opinion, Americans need to make it clear to their government that Israel's settlement of the West Bank and the human rights abuses that accompany these efforts are wrong. Now, I have 3 things that I think the U.S. should do to make up for its complicity in the issue and to literally just save the lives of these people living in this area. I think they need to stop arms sales to Israel until these illegal settlements stop. That's the first one, right? Mm-hmm. Until these, we've talked about the myriad of ways that they're illegal, but until these settlements stop, we should not be selling them weapons.
Because that's
that
what
they can use to enforce
Yeah,
and subjugate.
Exactly.
Secondly, we need to apply sanctions to Israeli exports to the U.S. Now, we can reduce these sanctions incrementally in exchange to any human rights progress that is being made and a more active curbing of these settlements. So if the Israeli government is actively acting against these illegal settlements, or if they're improving the human rights situation, removing blockades, we can incrementally decrease these sanctions.
Okay. So if I'm correct here, that is our way of assuring that Palestine can receive some of its freedom and some of the rights and responsibilities.
Some of the basic rights and dignities that they deserve.
Correct. Okay.
And finally, the U.S. should support the creation of a Jewish state, but condemn the projection of Israeli power into the West Bank and Gaza. I think the U.S. needs to commit itself to a future where Palestinians have their own state. I don't think there's any way around it. I don't think there's any way for this problem to be solved unless Palestinians have territory that they both control and are not subject to Israeli blockades, to Israeli enforcement actions, to Israeli arbitrary seizures, and Israeli demolitions. I think there is no way around this conflict where, again, over 1,000 rockets were fired last month in less than a week. It will happen again and again and again until there are 2 states. Just like originally was intended, just like originally was planned. Maybe not quite as jigsaw-y, but there needs to be an area of land on the sacred, around Jerusalem, where Palestinians enjoy all the rights and dignities of any other human group.
Yeah. It's going to be almost extremely unlikely that Israel is just going to give that land back to Palestine. So there has to be a third party that plays a significant role in enabling Israel and Palestine to have peace. And that's where
international actors have to step up.
Exactly.
They have to they have to provide sanctions. They have to, ridicule or do whatever they can to get the Israeli government to be reasonable in this situation. And now I want to, this has been a long podcast as far as podcasts go, but I want to finish with what viewers can do. Anyone who's listening to this podcast, obviously talk to your senator, your House representative, just do all that stuff. But also, you've been on the ground, you've been in Israel, you've seen the situation there with your own eyes. I was wondering, is there any organization or cause or movement that you want to give a shout out to, as a way for any of the audience to get involved? Is there any organization you support that you think can help put an end to this human rights problem?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I would like to recognize the American Task Force on Palestine. They're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and they're dedicated to advocating for an end to conflict through a negotiated agreement between Israel and Palestine. So
the American Task Force on Palestine is what the group is, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And their end goal is to achieve a 2-state solution. as we were suggesting earlier, to where living side by side, they live in peace and security.
Okay, awesome. So for anyone listening, any of our viewers, the American Task Force in Palestine, non-profit, non-partisan organization, highly recommended by our lovely guest Patrick Johnson here.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you for being a guest. It's been great having you on the show.
It's been a pleasure.
And hopefully we'll have you back on. And yeah, that's the end of the podcast. That's it, fuckers. This has been the legal lawyer, and we will see you next time.